As we continue our study of the book of Exodus, we come now to what's called the Covenant Code. And this is a technical term for something that really, as you have seen, is a varied list of types of laws from chapters 21 through chapter 23 and a little bit already in chapter 20 of Exodus. The Covenant Code is filled with what's by and large called casuistic law or case law. There are some apodictic laws there as well. Now, this is a distinction that's been made about, for some people, what's unique about the biblical laws versus laws in other ancient cultures. And maybe it doesn't hold as much water as it once did, but an apodictic law would be something like, you shall have no other gods. Anyone who strikes his father and mother shall be put to death. A law that apodikeo simply means to say something is wrong and that's it. But there are also case laws here. And a case law would be something that would say, for example, if a man kills another man and he dies, he shall be put to death. But if it happens that God allowed him to fall into his hand and he didn't do it on purpose, then he will not be put to death. He can go to a city of refuge. So a case law is a kind of a law that has, if this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then this happens. And it recognizes that not everyone is going to be judged, even if a result is the same, by the same standard. If a man hated another man, then he would be put to death if he killed him. But if they were good friends and they had a hunting accident, then there would be a different resolution to the conflict. And there are even cities of refuge that are set up to which someone should run and go if they have indeed killed someone who was their friend, and gives them time to clear their name. Um, as we look at these laws in this covenant code, and there will be other codes and other groups of material, there's a lot of laws in the book of Leviticus, particularly chapters 17 to 26. There are laws particularly from chapter 12 through 25 of the book of Deuteronomy, which means the second giving of the law. Again, I'd like to point out that law can be used in two different senses. And it's helpful to recognize that when we are looking at the word law in the Bible, if we think of the word Torah comes from a Hebrew word which means to kind of throw a stone, and yara means to throw a stone in this direction. So a wisdom teacher might sit down and say, now boys, you have to watch out, because if you go this way, and he'd pick up a stone, kind of throw it, he says, you start getting on this path and you're going to end up in a life of crime. He'll pick up another stone and throw it, and he'll say, you go this way, then you can expect good things will happen to you. It's not as much of a promise as kind of a trajectory on which one would go. And that term then began to be used for any time somebody would instruct someone about how to act in the future, dependent upon what one knows about the past. The context for everything that we have here is that covenant. Take the covenant, the promise of God, the relationship that God promises to have with his people, take that away, and then you just have a religion. You simply have rules that people are to obey so they can get along in society. Then you may as well have another Boy Scout code. Then it's everyone deciding for himself or herself, what kind of rules are we going to have to live by? There are actually some improvements here. If you look at a passage like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the eye for eye and tooth for a tooth we might think is rather harsh, that if I hurt someone else and he lost his eye, then they poke mine out. And we would say that seems very barbaric. It used to be, and Lamech in the early part of Genesis even boasts about this, I killed a man for striking me. He went way overboard. Now, some people would say that those apodictic laws are only in Israel's law code, and that all the laws in Babylonian law codes, like what's called the law code of Lipit Ishtar or the code of Hammurabi, that those codes are all these casuistic if-then types of laws. But they have found some categorical denials of certain kinds of activities in other cultures as well. I think the main point is not what typology we have for the laws, but what's the motivation. The very end of this section is going to talk to the people about the fact that God would send his angel ahead of them, and they are going to go into a land. It will take a time for them to be able to claim the land. If they killed everybody all at once, it says, well, then there would be wild beasts running all over, and God doesn't want that. So over time, he will help you to take that land. But we have then all this great variety of detailed laws. If we're used to reading a narrative like the story of Joseph, where it goes from one stage to another, this is just very, very different kind of material. And I must say that there are people who have struggled through as they try to read the Bible all the way through. They've gotten through Genesis, and they've even gotten up to Exodus 24. But at that point, with the sealing of the covenant that we'll look at next time, that's about as far as they go. And then when they get into the details of the tabernacle, they say, there is no point to this, and they go on to something else. But each one of these stages has some very, very interesting insight. Here, for example, I'm not going to start with all the details, but look at a concept that we have. The concept of Torah, or of law. Think about the two major kind of ways in which we talk about laws. One is a speed limit law. You do this, you go too fast, and you're going to get a ticket if you get caught. And there's always that get caught kind of thing. The other kind of law, though, is a law like a law of nature, like the law of gravity. And the law of gravity says, here's the way this was built. When we look at the Torah, we're really looking at how did God build things? How did he make it so that things would work naturally? And what happens in a fallen world? Now, if we are going to go completely natural, then we are going to say that all human beings are equal. There's no power play going on, and everyone would love their neighbor as they love themselves. We don't have that here. But we do have more than simply some rules that will help keep a society together. There's a motivation for why. God says, because of what I'm doing for you, here's what you do for each other. Notice, for example, with the encouragement to treat the stranger well. You were strangers in Egypt, and you remember how terrible it was when you were beaten and whipped as you were doing your work for the Pharaoh. Now that you see strangers around you, don't treat them the same way. Remember what happened to you, and what happened in your past is to motivate what will happen in the future. In some sense, it's almost as if we could take every one of these laws and look at what it describes and hold it up to a mirror, and in the other side of the mirror we would see people doing the very opposite. So if man digs a hole and someone's ox falls in the hole, and then the ox dies, well, it happened. It had happened in history. So now here come a set of instructions to say, now how do you resolve that? What's right and a proper, fair way? What happens if a man's ox gores a child? Every once in a while you see on rodeos on some of the TV channels where a bull will come and it will gore someone who it has just thrown. I saw one of these on TV just a couple of nights ago, and I don't know if the man was killed or seriously injured. There, of course, he's putting himself in harm's way. But let's say that someone has an animal that gets loose and gores a child or an adult or a slave. What are you going to do about that? What's going to happen if that ox was used to goring? Well, if the ox was used to goring, they not only put the ox to death, but its owner, who should have found a way to keep that ox from getting out. Just like sometimes today we'll have certain kinds of dogs that will get out of a yard and will maul a child or an adult. We've yet to have a penalty of death for the owner. The cry goes up even when the dog is shot, like a pit bull or something like that is shot, then there's a cry about cruelty to animals. But what we have here is everything where there is instruction about not doing something, it had been going on. And for example, the one that I think is so insightful for us in the story of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke. If a man strikes his neighbor and he hurts him so he can't go to work, then he is to take care of his expenses until he gets well. What does the Good Samaritan do? He acts as if he was the one who had beaten that man up on the road. Whereas the priest and the Levite walk by on the other side and say it's the guy's own fault, this man acts as if it was his fault, which is an unbelievable picture of what our Lord does. When he hangs on the cross, he acts as if it's his fault. And that picks up on this instruction from way back when that says you beat somebody up and you hurt them, you take care of their family until they get well. And this man who puts the wounded individual on his donkey and gives some money to the innkeeper in that story that Jesus tells is one who is acting as if it was his fault. God was saying long, long ago, I am calling you to be holy and righteous. If an animal gets torn to bits by some other animal, you're a holy, set-apart people. You give the animal's flesh to the dogs, but you don't eat it. If an ox kills another ox, you have to sell the one that you have and divide the money between the two of the people. And so nobody has an ox then. Once in a while, there are ways out. If somebody, for example, has killed someone, then they can go to this city of refuge. There might be a way out that if they have hurt someone, they can pay a fine. But there's also things mixed in here about worship. 3 times a year you are to appear before the Lord, but don't offer any bloody sacrifice with leavened bread. Always use unleavened bread. Take 6 days of work. The 7th day, take off. 6 years of work for your field. The 7th year, let it lie fallow, and let the strangers and the orphans and the widows take care of it. So we've got strangers living in the country. We've got widows. We've got orphans. Those who are on the margin of society. The land itself. God says, I want you to let everything have a rest. I'll bless you. I'll watch over you. So we have these types of laws, some of which are very, very puzzling and troubling to us. What do we do with laws about slavery? Doesn't it seem that God must be approving of slavery if he is going to instruct them about how to carry it out in a right way or a wrong way? If you have a fellow Hebrew slave, 6 years, and just like your land, you let lie fallow, the 7th year he goes free. If you're going to loan someone some money, then make sure that you don't loan it to them with exorbitant interest. And that was followed in the New Testament as well. So the Jewish people were the bankers for the Christians, because the Christians were told you can't make money off your neighbor, but if someone wanted to borrow money and they were willing to pay the interest, then they would go to a Jewish person who was able to serve as the banker for them. But what are some of the other things? Well, what about this slavery business? All we can say is in that culture, it was acceptable. That was the way in which people were able to borrow money. Today, we would ask, what is your collateral? Well, in the ancient world, very often the collateral was someone's life. We sign a letter of intent to pay it back. Our collateral is our good job. Well, what happens if a man only has enough to take care of his family? Well, if he got in trouble, or if he wanted to buy some land and things went bad for him, maybe there was a crop that was destroyed, then he might have to say to somebody else, I'm willing to work for you, and in exchange for that, will you give me my keep? Some even went to the point of marrying into the family and saying, I want to stay here. What if a man sells his daughter? The troublesome thing is it's not condemned. There's nothing that says he should quit doing that. But it says only if a man sells his daughter to another man as a servant, and that man takes her as wife, or gives her to his son's wife, if there is a falling apart of the ways and a parting of the ways, then she's not to be sold on to a foreigner. She can be redeemed. Her father can give the price to get her back for himself. She's not to be shamed as a foreigner would be. But we're going to have to live with some of the tension here and recognize it, that what's going on is something that's abhorrent to us, that a person would own someone else. We don't know all the details of this, whether this was something that was as harsh as we might think with the pictures from the Ten Commandments about the Israelites getting whipped by Pharaoh's taskmasters, or whether it was simply that of a worker in a factory type situation, except out in a farm where that person was working for someone else and then got enough to live on as a result. So it's too far back for us to get all of the insight about that, but we do know these issues came up, and that was part of the accepted society of the day. What happens if somebody breaks in your house? Well, it's okay to kill him if it's dark. But if it's light and you can see what he's doing, and you can kick him out of there, then you are in trouble if you have caused his death. So there are all sorts of limits, and the whole question that is true in every age: where do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Best understanding of that is, if you've got a goat and it has a baby goat, then you don't take that baby goat and kill it and then use the milk from the mother to make the liquid for the stew in which you would cook that baby goat right in front of that mother. Well, that's been expanded into the kind of laws that the Jewish people will follow today, the laws of what is kosher, the kashrut laws, and it says don't ever, so that you put a fence around the law, that you make sure you think of every possible example. Never put meat on a hamburger and then put cheese on with it. You never know whether the cheese was made from the milk of the mother that bore the calf that grew up to be the cow that was slaughtered, that has turned into your hamburger. You don't drink milk when you're drinking meat. You don't put butter on bread when you're drinking meat. The Jewish people have by and large seen these as a set of customs that kind of hold them as a people together. And an Orthodox Jew will do everything that he or she can to try to follow all of those laws as implicitly as possible, and will believe that this is a way to show respect for God and a respect for others, even if they are not always aware of the ramifications of it for today. I've known a couple of different Jewish families where there was a separate rack in the dishwasher, one for all the plates that had been touched by meat, one for all of the plates and cups that had been touched by milk products, so that those at least didn't directly come in contact with each other. Well, we might think that this is going way overboard. These laws were not given just to show the people that they couldn't and that they wouldn't obey them. Yes, Paul in Romans will say the law was meant to work wrath. It works wrath if we look at it as a means of trying to please God. And that's what Paul's talking about. But for those who are being guided and who might say, I don't know what's right and wrong here, do we have any kind of guidance? Then it's a very good thing. And so the Jews have a celebration, Jewish people have a celebration the fall of the year, usually in October, I believe it is, called Simchat Torah, rejoicing in the law, thankful that God gave us some insight. How to solve this problem? What are we going to do when we find that someone has done this or done that? How will we resolve these? And rather than saying that these are laws that God's putting a gun to someone's head to obey, they are rather very serious, but they are only kind of for instances of the types of issues that come up. And in these 3.5 chapters, our head can be spinning very quickly. Put a sorceress to death. Put to death one who curses or strikes his father or mother. These are issues that are very, very severe. And today, if someone was to kill his son for having cursed him, that person would be in jail. But here in that society, there are these things which keep that society together, and it's almost like there is an encouragement for the good of a community. What are the kinds of laws that one should obey? And I don't think we think about this as much in our modern individualistic day, when we think about the laws and the rules of I'll make my mind up what I want to do. It is really a sin against the entire community when someone sins. It is not a private matter. When the president says that his sin is something to deal with his wife and with his God, he's really not sensing what the Old Testament was all about. Every sin was not only against God, it was against all the other members of the community as well. Sometimes through action, through a sin of commission, where somebody killed someone else on purpose, where somebody stole some of their neighbor's animals. Or it could be a sin of omission. I see my neighbor in need and I don't help. And those kinds of things, it's all interrelational. Sometimes even with the animals, as boiling the kid in his mother's milk. Sometimes with the soil and providing for the soil to lie fallow. But it's all with a creation that God made. Even if the word of God as creator isn't mentioned here, this is the world God made, and he says, no matter what's in your heart, in your activities, I want you to treat this in such a way that you give the creation respect, that you give the animals respect, that you watch out for when the animals might hurt each other and try and keep that from happening, and that above all, you give fellow human beings the respect that comes to them because I chose them. Whether it be someone who's on an equal level with you, where you help them whether you really like them or not, whether it's someone who is a stranger or a sojourner, where you help them because you were once like that, whether it's a family member. It seems like all of this elevates the relationship between God and people, and then with people with one another, that's elevated to a level much more than just let's do this right and let's not do this. But it is the whole sense of that context of I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't make any idols. Don't use my name for any other reason than it's to be used for. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. Don't curse them. Don't strike them. You shall not kill. Here's what happens if you do. You shall not commit adultery. Here's what happens if you do. You shall not steal or bear false witness or covet. And so we really have kind of a jumbled bunch of laws kind of intermingled here, kind of like a bowl of spaghetti in some ways, that really all reflect what we've just seen in those 10 summary words. These are not simply rules to get God, to get them out of Sinai. They are rather instructions for people who've already been made part of a covenant. Behind every one of these would be, because the Lord brought you out of the land of Egypt, therefore you shall do this, and this is the right way, and this will give you a sense of what everything is that you should do. So to meditate and really think on these, not just to jump to a conclusion and say, well, I know what this means, or I don't like this law, but to reflect very, very deeply on what God might be saying to us in our day and age to deal with issues that are going to be similar. We don't have laws for everything in the Bible, and I don't think anybody could write enough laws to satisfy every human being. There's always some other case that would have to be brought up. But what we do have is a sense of how does God deal with us, and how do we deal with each other, and what does it mean to be part of a community, and what do we do when we have some who are richer and some who are poorer. All of those 10 summary words really have ramifications all over the map, because they are all suggestive of the kinds of issues that come up in the real world. This is not something that's boring and out of date if we really reflect on it. It is rather of the sum and substance of what it means to live a daily life. How are we going to be people who will live life with one another and be honorable toward each other, to care for each other? And we're called to do so not simply because we are citizens of a country and we're trying to be good moral people. This is much more than just morals. This is the depth of the entire relationship with God spilling out in the way we deal with others. We might think if we're going to come and show God how good we are, then what's wrong with us can be toward our neighbor. But God turns us around and he says, I take what's wrong with you, and then I equip you so that you can go out and care for others. There's an interesting kind of connection here between the legal material and wisdom material. If you would look at the book of Proverbs, for example, it would give all sorts of indications about the right way to live and dangers in the wrong way to live. It's not as much force of law as teaching, but now this is elevated to another level for the adults, where they are told, here is a proper way to live out your life, here's a proper way to respond, and here's an improper way. Here are the borders that God gives, the parameters in which you are to live, and this entire collection of material all revolves around that fact of what God had done and what he was doing for them, and that their response then would be to respect God's presence among them. This is not something where they would act and then come report to the boss later. They were to know that God was there, and thus the condemnation of worshiping any other gods. If this is the one who is supporting you, then there is no way that you can go to someone else and try and get some other god to give you the protection that can only come from the one who brought you out of Egypt. And thus, as we look at this entire section, we realize that the problems that are here are only a tip of the iceberg. There was much more that went on, and we will see other laws about boundaries that would be moved, and relationships between certain family members and where the limits to those relationships are. We have just a few of those here, but we really cover a wide variety of the types of topics that are all mentioned in the 10 words, the 10 summary statements, the 10 commandments, if you will. Remember, though, these commandments are not a commandment that says you do it or else. The you shall not is not an imperative that says don't do it. But it's almost like these laws and the 10 words say, now, here you are in this relationship with God. You're not to be doing this in the relationship, or you'll leave it. This is not right, you'll leave it. Now, that's a very deep statement, but it's not with as much anger in the heart or in the voice as it is with, it is inappropriate for someone who's in this relationship to act this way. And thus, when we look at what is said in all of these, it really says, because of that new life you have, it's inappropriate to be living a life any other way than the one that God has provided for you. So I hope you can also be encouraged in this, that you can recognize that here as well, God is giving us guidance for our daily life, not rules to get him to bless us, but because he already has for us in his death and resurrection and in holy baptism, he will also open our eyes so that we reflect on all the times when we might either act against another or not act when we can. And instead of saying, well, that's who I am, we are called to remember, who did you make me to be? That's the motivation for everything here. Thank you, and God's continued blessings to you as you study this book of the Old Testament and prepare now to go up to the mountain with those first elders and leaders to celebrate in the presence of God. It's the kind of thing that we do when we're instructed in worship, and then we go into the presence of God and feed or are fed by his body and blood. He prepares us for that, and then he welcomes us to come and receive strength from him for the task at hand. Thank you. God's richest blessings to you.